back to the channel. And if you're like me, you're getting inspired by lots of wonderful ideas for new projects. But in the next couple of videos, we're going to talk about how do you find the perfect pattern and, more importantly, adapt that pattern to suit your individual style. And today I'm going to use a pattern I created to illustrate some examples. So this is a fisherman's rib knit ski sweater, and I'll use it again to illustrate step by step some of the examples I'm going to highlight today. So it'll be no surprise to anyone that the first thing we're going to do when we think about patterns is check our gauge. And so we're probably using a different yarn. We have different hands, and so we're going to knit up a swatch and compare that swatch to the original pattern. So we're not picking any patterns that don't list the gauge because we're going to get frustrated. So on the original pattern that I created for this sweater, my gauge was 20 by 18 and I was using a 4-weight yarn. Now I have lots of this yarn because it's my play yarn that I experiment with. It's very affordable. So what I did was basically just double up the strands of yarn because I have lots of it and I wanted a really chunky looking version. So when I did that, my gauge changed to 10 by 10. And again, same yarn, so really easy to illustrate for you, but you could have a completely different yarn and have different considerations. I also went big and doubled up the size of the needle, and I used an 8 because again, I was going big or go home. I wanted really chunky looking yarn. So now I've got the pattern gauge and the new gauge for my new yarn and my hand. And the original was 20 by 18, and we can figure out our stitch per inch. And then the textbook knitting math says if we're comparing my gauge to the old gauge, I would end up basically, if I had in the original pattern been told to cast on 100 stitches, be casting on 50 stitches. So I know that roughly this pattern should be reduced by half in order to get the end result the same as the pattern. But I can tell you that I went through the rest of the steps and I'll walk you through those. And if I had just looked at that 50% reduction, I would be very frustrated. The sweater would not have turned out and I'd have to make lots of changes. So what else do we have to think about? Well, because I was doing a top down, I actually cast on the same exact number of stitches as I was playing around. I started again increasing for the backs, the raglan sleeves, and the front and the neckline, as you do for all top-down sweaters. And again, if you're not familiar with fisherman's rib, you're actually working a reversible fabric. So the light blue is on the inside, the dark blue is on the outside, and so again, you're doubling up your rows here because I'm basically knitting both, versions together at the same time. So what really matters is to think about the stitch that you're using before you go through and start anything. Kind of make notes on the pattern. Again, looking at that 50% the 50% decrease. But a fisherman's rib before you join in the round is a 4-row repeat pattern. And so you may have to round up or you may have to round down depending on the stitch that you're using to, again, you can't just go with 50%. So you've got some, thinking to do as you think about the stitch counts. And then when you join in the round, it becomes a 2-row repeat. So again, factoring all of that in, and every time I increase, I've been adding 2 stitches, not just 1, to keep the rib pattern. Now, when I counted rows, because we've been talking about stitch counts, and we know how to adapt for those, rows matter a little bit less, but they're key in certain areas, and so sweaters are an easy piece to start playing around with adaptations and fit, but rows really matter for things like necklines. And so again, because I had the measurements on my pattern for where I wanted the neckline to be, and I was now wanting to see exactly where the orange first neckline was, that was row 37. Well, the neckline for the navy sort of chunkier version was at row 25. And then as I went down and continued my increases, because you can see that the more rows you add makes a deeper neckline, so it affects your neckline, also affects, very importantly, the size of your armholes. So you're wanting to make sure your armholes are the right size for you. And again, in the single strand, I'm increasing for the armholes until row 43. I had far fewer rows to increase on this, much bigger, chunkier version. But it wasn't when I checked the measurements at exactly that 50% math rate. So when we're thinking about rows, I kind of go with the saying of think less about the number of rows and more about your inches or centimeters. So again, we don't want to pick a pattern that doesn't tell us what the finished size of the piece is in inches or centimeters, so we can, not get frustrated and know exactly how to adapt these things. We also want to think as we continue working down where we might want to do increases or decreases, because that really matters for shaping the sweater. And so I don't like it when people tell me the knit row and not again the size. So in the pattern, I didn't do increases, but if you were making it for someone with a much larger bust line, I do highlight where you need to factor in doing those increases, adding increases to just the front, again, to increase for the bust line. And again, making sure you remember you have to add 2 stitches to keep this rib kind of appearance repeat. Otherwise, your rows are all going wonky. And so again, here's where you can measure. Again, if you have someone with a larger bust line, this is where you make that increase. I did do on the pattern bigger decreases at the waist. You can see those in the pictures. So again, if you know where, the measurements are and you can measure your waist, you're not going to be worried about which row. You're just going to, again, put the decrease for your waist at the exact right spot for you. And then you can also increase back over the hips. For this one, I did do decreases, but not as many as I did, so it was a slightly chunkier version again. But I also played around with just reversing simply the colors. So we're flipping the navy for the lighter blue, and again, it will be exactly the same on the reverse because it's a reversible sweater. So you can play around. I could have done a much smaller reverse trim at the bottom. You could have done one, at the waist level. So again, think about just not only shaping with increases and decreases, but using color to accent as well. And on the final measurement piece, I highlighted that for me, a medium size takes me 15 inches from the bottom of your armhole to the bottom of the hem. And so I'm giving, again, a very specific measurement and row count. But that doesn't restrict you. If you want a longer sweater, please do continue adding rows and adapting to make the sweater body slightly longer just by adding rows, and it's an easy adaptation. Again, working and thinking in inches or centimeters. So it's an easy way. Again, think rows and think inches, and you'll be able to successfully kind of follow the pattern through and make all of the appropriate changes at the appropriate times. So my final sweater, if you can see, I've just laid the orange one slightly underneath here, and I was able to double check, yes, the 15 inches matches exactly. The length of the arm at the finished piece matches exactly, but your row counts, no surprise, are far reduced because I had a much bigger gauge on the bigger, chunkier kind of yarn piece when I was looking at the number per inch. So this is an arm that I was playing around with. I actually frogged it out, and you'll see the finished piece is fisherman rib all the way down because this looked horrible on me, but I was just testing out, again, different ideas and experimenting. I was asked if you did want to transition from this really chunky rib to something different, how do you help make that a nicer transition? My tip, and I put this in the notes as well, is to just slip off the ribs and knit the pearls to kind of even out that transition and make it smooth so that there's no big pearl bumps in it. The other transition ask that I got was, you can see here, I put crochet ribs on the cuffs. I do often have mixes between crochet and knit, and all I did here was cast off the yarn, but instead of tying off, I used that last loop to begin my crochet, and I just crocheted into that last cast off row to create a reversible rib stitch, but I wanted, again, that chunkier look that the crochet was giving me for a really chunky looking rib on the finish for the armhole trim as well. So again, lots of ways that you can experiment and adapt, but with an arm, again, you can make it wider, you can make it narrower, and do the increases and decreases to fit your particular style. So as I'm thinking about making notes on a pattern as I do a first run through, again, I don't even bother doing that until I look at the gauge and really figure out the differences between my gauge and the pattern gauge and my yarn and the pattern yarn. So I'm thinking through that before I even start so I don't get frustrated and then don't complete the project. I'm also thinking through, again, what stitch am I using? Are there pattern repeats in it that I have to factor in? And that's creating some slight changes again on my stitch count. So thinking that through before you start, because once I go, I might miss a step and forget it. So again, an example using the fisherman's rib, a kind of list of things that you might need to think through as you make adaptations to a pattern, and then it really stops you being frustrated, and I find it a lot more enjoyable to go through and adapt things so they fit my particular style. So a fisherman's rib sweater, and you can see version 1 and chunky version 2. Thanks for all your likes and subscribes, and again, thanks for watching.